Welcome to Beyond the Platform. I'm your host, Tony Montgomery, and with me today we have Jordan Shallow. If you want an introduction to him, just check out the first episode. I think you were like the inaugural guest. And yes, and if you don't know who Jordan is, that's shame on you. You're probably not listening to the podcast right now, anyways. But first question, serious question. When you look across at the screen and you see there's no beard, is like that a level of disappointment that you can't fathom?
No, you know what? I look at you like a wizard, Tony. I've always looked at you like a wizard. And I actually just watched Lord of the Rings the other day, and hand to God, I was thinking of you. Like, because it's like Gandalf, it goes from Gandalf the Gray to Gandalf the White. And I assume there's like an ascension period where Gandalf has no beard. So past the white is this oracle wizard, and that's what you are to me, is like this oracle wizard. So you actually seem more like like almost like a deity now, like the Buddha or something, like all knowing, omnipresent, omnipotent. That's you, man. So no, I
Dang.
dig it. It's all in the evolution, because you posted that video of the squat from Record Breakers,
Yeah.
and that was like peak level Gandalf the Gray shit. But I still see it when I look at you, but I understand the evolution and the ascension of wizardry status that you've gone through, man. So I think it's fitting.
I appreciate that, man. I feel like after that, with the whole deity thing, I can probably start my own cult and move out to somewhere in Texas and live a good life.
Yeah, yeah. Do like a Jonestown without the poison thing. Maybe like an Om Shinrikyo. Whatever you're into, man. I'd follow you. I'd follow you to the ends of the earth.
I appreciate that. I watched Waco on Netflix, so I have a pretty good baseline of how to get this thing going.
Yeah, you're set. You're
Oh,
set. It's pretty much a how-to guide.
good. Most documentaries are. That's why I watch them. They're all how-to guides on how to not get caught doing stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So you think about doing the same, cleaning up, looking more respectable?
No, no, because I would only disappoint, Tony. I would only disappoint if I looked respectable and then opened my mouth and said anything. So I was like, all right, this is the facial representation of the crap that's going to come out of said face. I just can't do it, man. You know what? Funny you mentioned that. I actually thought about it when I got back from Australia. I had to quarantine for 2 weeks. And I'm like, I bet you if I shave my beard, I could go into a gym in Toronto and no one would have any idea who the fuck I am,
For sure.
and like just be able to train. But then as I was walking back, I went out. I forget what I was doing. I had to go outside for some reason. I think it was my hour of exercise. And someone stops me on the street and goes, "Oh my God, Joe Bennett." I'm like, "Fuck off." But yeah, I think the beard's here to stay.
Nice, man. Nice. How's things in Canada? And you had a two-year hiatus of just being like a nomad and traveling around. I'm sure that was fun in and of itself, but now you're back home in the motherland and trying to settle down and be a normal human being. How's that transition?
Yeah, it's been good, man. Like, it'll be weird being in one place and working almost entirely online. Last time I was stationary, I still, was still working in person with the running the strength and conditioning program at Stanford. I was still in person, doing like Hyro thing out of CSA and Boss Barbell. So this will be weird to have like a shingle and a mailing address, but no real office to go to, although we might be changing that. But still, all the stuff we do now is primarily online and has been for the better part of 2 years. So yeah, it's fun, like different. I can order shit off Amazon now, which I'm really stoked about,
Yeah.
because I know exactly where to send it. I've lost so many packages, dude, where it's like you call an Airbnb or message Airbnb, like, hey, what's the exact address? Because I want to like express post something, and then like something ends up in the mail, and then like I got a pair of Jordans sitting in an Airbnb, and it's a day after I've left. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, all right. I hope someone in the house is a size 12. Like, you're welcome.
Yeah, for sure, man. I can see the frustration in that. So you're done. No more hands-on, none of that, not even like from a strength conditioning perspective or anything. Like what would make you leave the confines of your home?
Oh, dude, like once the legislation gets lifted on, like, I just can't afford now to be doing 2 weeks on the back end locked up in my condo. So I'm actually going to New Orleans, as mentioned, and that's going to be like, that's hands on with like one individual athlete, which is more how I'm looking to operate into the future, is just kind of concierge setting. I got, I don't know, 10 or 12 guys across various professional sports leagues, and NFL kind of being my biggest one. So if I want to get back into one-on-one, the teaching and stuff is still going to be there, albeit a little bit more sparse as we were trying to push really for the online. But the in-person stuff will be more just getting back to kind of like the roots of S&C with mixing in some of the rehab Cairo stuff as well. So I can't wait to start traveling again, man. I don't like being in one place. It makes me uneasy. It makes me unsettled. Like I feel like I'm dying. But yeah, it'll be in a much different capacity moving into 2021 as things open up.
So the idea is to be like more the holistic strength and conditioning coach that covers all the ends of the dynamics of, speed, conditioning, strength conditioning, and then taking care of the body. That's kind of what you're doing in small spurts at a time.
Yeah, so like a lot of my guys I'll program for like the strength and conditioning piece, like their off season and obviously transitioning into in season poses its difficulties as you now have to sort of coalesce with the team strength and conditioning staff. But I've been given, I work with some guys that are pretty good, and they vet me and we talk and they go, okay, like this is one less guy I got to worry about. If Jordan's taking care of him, he's taken care of, and I got 54 other guys I can worry about. But yeah, so in the off season and in the times between meeting in person, it's, programming in a similar fashion that we would program for barbell athletes or any sort of online client. Obviously communication is going to be the biggest one there. And then we start to plan for times during the year where, New Orleans in a few weeks, one of my guys is going into week 13. So we have a bye week. And then in that bye week, it's like, all right, now we have some time to work together, tighten up some execution stuff in the gym, get on the table, see what we can work on for the latter half of the season. So that's really kind of where I'm aiming my focus more towards that method of operation, rather than just like opening up a clinic again and just kind of seeing the general public. I definitely want to start to play around almost exclusively with just sort of high-end assets and athletes.
Yeah, I like that approach. The idea of opening up your own clinic is very similar to the idea of personal trainers wanting to open their own gym. It's like, it's a good thought, but what are you trying to get out of it? Are you, a lot of people, at least when I first started, was thinking they want to open up a gym to be like Joe DeFranco's. And it's like, what does that mean? Right. And it means, well, what you see on YouTube is what you think you get. But I've been to Joe's place. I've spent a couple of weeks with him. And I would say that when I was there, at least 70% of his clients were, stay-at-home moms and stuff still.
Yeah. The athletes are tricky, man. I think there's a changing of the tide in the value that athletes are putting into this type of service and treatment and coaching. Like I think LeBron is actually one of the ones to thank for that. Like I forget the exact number. It's something like 1.2 million. LeBron will spend a season on, having his trainer with him, bringing his massage therapist out, getting his food prep, getting all like, his fridges stocked when he's in all these cities. And it's like, well, yeah, man, like if you extend your season or extend your career rather by 2 or 3 seasons, especially if you're LeBron, like you'll make that back by like the tip off of the second game. Like You're going to be all right. And I think it's like everything, man, like there's a decentralization away from institutions. And I think professional sports are going to have to, at some point, get away from the nepotism that drives the way medical staffs are being put together, right? Like how many times I've walked in for job interviews or dropped off resumes, and you realize that the strength coach is fucking married to the owner's daughter. It's like, I swear to God, strength coaches that are smart, they just case out all the owners that have daughters.
Yeah.
And they just like, they make them fall in love with them or something. And like, just so they can get this fucking job. So, I want to go straight to the end user. I want to go straight to the athlete. I want to go to an athlete that values, a very personal, tailored service. And nothing against the guys that got to run team. Fuck, dude. Like, run team in the past, and it definitely has its challenges as far as like, even as diligent as one person could be, you're still spread thin across 50, 60 guys or girls in a weight room. Like you can't possibly provide the same service as I have, a dozen guys that I can check in on a daily basis, that I can, communicate with, I can fly to and see in person. Like that I think is going to be where the trend starts to go at the professional ranks.
Yeah, for sure. I see that a lot too with a lot of people going into the private sector, especially I guess now it makes a little bit more sense with COVID. You didn't really have a choice but to kind of try to find different means of preparing yourself. And I actually like the idea of not having to deal with the sports coaches as much too, because that's a whole different dynamic in and of itself. But knowing you, I'd have to imagine, because you grew up playing hockey and there's not much real football in Canada for you to like really test your metal at. So I would assume, knowing you though, you're starting to study that stuff a little bit more so that you're able to. Because I feel like some of the best strength coaches are also putting as much effort into sports coaching as well, so they know the dynamics of what goes into being that athlete. You know, like anything, as a strength coach, you need to know what it's like to be an athlete in order to coach an athlete. That doesn't mean you have to perform at the highest level, but if you're an MMA coach, you should be doing some form of MMA training. If you're a football coach, you should be doing some form of, review and studying of the tape and things like that. Are you doing a lot of that right now?
Yeah, especially with special teams guys, like because football is like 6 or 7 different sports being played simultaneously,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Like, and that's the hard part with the combine system and what they do in Indy every year, and kind of like, and I think another transition that I think is noticeable and beneficial is not only is the strength coach is starting to learn more about like the player coach and the head coach and the sport coach role, the good sport coaches are starting to really understand the S&C side. So you can get like a good relationship where you can meet someone halfway. But in the NFL, especially like some of the special teams roles, quarterbacks and kickers, the shapes and systems are really weird. Like they're not like the way a kicker kicks a football. If you start to break it down, is like it is not meant to be sustainable, but fuck, they can just, that it's the only way they can launch the ball the way they do it. And there's like, you have to start to identify different patterns. Like there's basically 2 different ways that people kick in the league. One has a shorter half life, one has a much longer one. So yeah, a lot of it is just like identifying shapes and systems. One of my the guys I've been working with the longest is a kicker, and it's like he doesn't necessarily need to run,
Yeah.
right? So I need to tell a strength coach in the NFL that this guy's not going to be running gassers in the fucking first week of like some hell week thing. It's like,
So
no,
stupid.
he's got to take, right. He's got to take 2.5 steps, right? There's some games where he's fucking, he does nothing. If you guys don't put him in a position to do anything, like, so that's been a really fun challenge for me. And it was somewhat transferred over from like rugby, because I didn't have much familiarity with rugby when I started with the team there. But that definitely got me thinking more like about shapes and systems of sports. Because and there's some carryover with some of the positions in football to rugby, so that's helped with some of
Yeah.
my guys. But you bring up the mixed martial arts one. I'm not a huge mixed martial arts guy, but I started working with a couple of guys in the UFC, and that's what you have to go to. Like, I need to understand the difference between Greco-Roman, between striking, between jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, kickboxing, all this stuff, because it will drastically affect. And not only that, I find it's been beneficial to understand the strategy of the opponent and the skill set of the opponent.
Yeah.
Right, like if you're going to be taken to the ground, like, and this match is going to exist on the mat. This might be a slightly different, as we get more into the specific style of training towards the competition, towards the fight. Like, we might prepare differently in that higher specific phase, getting closer to the fight, for someone who's known to have a ground game. Like, if for someone who's known to want to roll and go the more jiu-jitsu route, rather than someone who's a more stand up and a striker. So yeah, it poses with it, man. Because like, I mean, I got into this when I first started with like, Olympic sports, like rowers and alpine skiers. Like,
Right.
that was kind of my first exposure to it. But then all of a sudden I did most of my learning and experience on a barbell with powerlifting.
Yeah.
It's like, here are the Crayola scissors. Don't hurt yourself. It's like, put it down. Like, here we go. And now it's so much fun to like be thrown back into the mix with like,
Yeah.
especially like MMA, like anything can happen, man. So, you just do what you can and hope for the best sometimes. And,
Right.
the skill training has to shine through. But yeah, it's a hell of a lot of fun, man. I love that. Right? Some of the ACLs, some of the injuries that have had happen early on in the season. It's like, well, yeah, like, who'd imagine, like, if you don't have an acclimation phase of a preseason, that these guys are
Yeah.
dropping a big block Chevy into a fucking Datsun frame, and they're just fucking tearing the chassis apart. It's like, no shit.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it has to be tough for people getting into sports right now, with the fact that there's no preparation. Because I've heard that before too, from a lot of strength and conditioning coaches that, and a lot of people, I guess, assume that if you're a professional athlete, you're going to take that job seriously and you're going to come to training camp in shape. And, it's like, well, how do you prepare for 30% of your guys being out of shape, 30% of your guys being okay, and then 30% actually following the plan and being ready to go? And, all those fundamental dynamics change everything. And it's like, now you do that at such a drastic, bigger scale because everything was shut down. How do you ramp that back up and do it in a way that's actually going to make sense is tough.
Oh yeah. I mean, I was prepping guys for camp that didn't have equipment.
Yeah.
So like part of my job was like, hey man, like I'm going to start calling around local gyms and seeing if I can call in some favors from my meathead friends and get you some bars and plates because you're a professional athlete. Like I'd call. Yeah. Oh dude. Like more than, and teams would send out like care packages. And it's like what you'd leave your physical therapist with. It's like, what is this guy going to do with a resistance band? Tell me, please, what he's going to do with a resistance band.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the fun. I think that's the fun part of like taking that, like you kind of said at the beginning, like that whole holistic approach. Cause like, I mean, I have one of my guys, I don't want to name names, but like he was eating like 1,500 calories a day and was maybe getting like 60 grams of protein. And it's like, dude, what, like you got the bone density of a fucking like grandma. What are you doing, man? And it was just little shit like that. So it was like, the job is almost, you just become like a logistics manager. Like, hey, I know a buddy that owns a food prep company in Jersey. Like, I'll talk to him. I'll get you some foods because I know you got kids and shit. Like, you just got to eat more than a fucking bikini competitor, dude. Like, what are you thinking? So it's been cool to kind of step outside of the realm of like just reps and sets and really try and get as much of a percentage increase as you can in all the facets that lead into sport performance.
Yeah, it's like all the things that you've studied and got really into, you're able to start utilizing some of them now. Whereas like as a barbell sport, there's not a lot of dimensions to it. It's very cut and dry. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, you were talking about the programming and stuff for the athletes. And one of the things I always think about is, you're preparing for the opponent a lot of times, but you're also preparing for that athlete in and of itself, right? And what their game is and how does that look different, from the other person. So if you take it from a football context, you have maybe two outside linebackers. One's more of a speed guy, one's more of a bull rusher. Are they going to train differently? And the answer is, well, yeah, probably for the most part, they're going to train pretty different if they want to like accentuate their skill components, which is always a fun thing too. But I think that gets missed a lot when it comes to like strength athletes. We put ourselves in this binary frame of mind of like, this is how things have to be done. We don't think like, well, where are our strengths? What am I best at? You're like, well, everyone else squats this way, so I guess this is just the right way to squat. And it's like, well, no, right? Like there's a million ways to do it properly, but no one ever takes into that consideration. You have Andrew Herbert who squats and it takes him forever to squat. Then you have a bigger guy like Chad Smith and he can just dive bomb it down there. Or Gowan, is that how you say his name in Australian?
Dwayne Johnson.
Yeah.
Big handsome. Yeah, big G.
And it's like, well, do you train for that specifically to accentuate those strengths, or are you looking at different dynamics? So when it comes to like the barbell stuff, because I know you guys have your barbell course coming out. If anybody's interested, I think you might have closed registration, but for the next semester, if people want to get into it. How are you thinking about that individualistically for athletes? Or is it because it's such a easy sport to like, I don't want to diminish the actual programming aspect and sport aspect of it, but I mean, let's be real. You're doing 3 fucking movements.
Yeah. So with powerlifting, like, no, because it's the discernment between absolute strength and skill strength is the same thing, right? Where like, if I'm in the weight room and I find this is like a plague that goes around like conventional strength conditioning of field sports, is they try and emulate shapes and positions that just leaves load off the bar. And it's like, like, oh, well, we get in this position when we're cutting, so we're going to do this with, dumbbells, it's like, look, you have one opportunity in here that you're not going to have anywhere else. Like you can get the relative skill strength by practicing the skill, right? But you will not have the ability to increase maximal strength anywhere else but in here,
Right.
right? So for a conventional sport, it should be a pretty easy thing that's like cut and dry, right? Like the guy who benches 225 for 32 reps doesn't bench 225 for 32 reps because he practices benching. Is he ends up benching 225 for 32 reps because he benches 500 pounds once,
Right.
right? Like that's with sprinting. So like, people can, if you can run a faster 60, like, or you can run a fast 40, no one, rarely is anyone laying out for a 40-yard straight sprint on the field.
Right.
Doesn't happen, right? There's going to be cutting, there's going to be, lateral movement, there's going to be tackles, there's going to be whatever, but all the movements in between will be faster if your top end speed is faster, right? Like if my horsepower is, if I can boost it to 750, well, I can get between two stop signs a lot quicker than another car.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. But in the gym, and when it comes to barbell sports, it's really a matter of like how it's like, I look at it like plate spinning. Like, okay, we're going into a meet prep. We're 16 weeks out. What plates are moving really fast for us, right? Which ones do we need to get spinning more if we don't pay attention to? They're going to dwindle when they cross the line. So like I spend a lot with most of my people now, and they're minimal in the barbell sports. It's really focusing on what you're doing when you're not on the barbell. Like some of your workouts are like, oh, I didn't squat, bench, and dead. It's like, exactly. It's just in the same way where it's like some of my workouts for some of my, like, I don't know, pick a sport, like a basketball player. Like their workouts are, here's 3 hours of exercise or 2 hours of exercise where you're not playing basketball.
Right.
You're in the gym, and that's it. Like it doesn't have to be anything more than that. With barbell training, I feel like there's been a push away from like actually putting on muscle, which is usually where it's like, all right, if we're going to build strength on like 8s and under, 6s and under, it'll be on a barbell. And we'll use a very close to competition variation, whether it be front, high bar, or safety, right? But if we're far out and I want to be pushing more volume, we're not going to hit sets of 15 on a barbell ever. No. I'm going to put sets of 15 on a leg press or a belt squat, right? Where it's like, make the exercise win. So I think that's something that people get lost. Like the hyper specificity, it's like, no. Like in certain phases, I look at it the same way. It's like, this is an opportunity. We're not going to have an opportunity to put on muscle 4 weeks out from the meet. Our training volume is going to be so low. Our training intensity is going to be so high. We're not going to be able to train with enough volume. Like when I usually go into a meet, my legs are the smallest that they ever are.
Oh yeah.
Like when I squat heavy, they're the small, because I've done maybe 20 reps in the last like 10 weeks. Right. They've been heavy, but they're not really going to drive that. So, depending on if someone has a lot of muscle and that's not something we need to focus on, then we might start going more specific to the competencies a little bit earlier. But if someone doesn't, I'm going to spend a lot of time basically just not getting them on the barbell, so that when we transition over, hopefully we can have some muscle underneath the bar, because like weight does move weight in a lot, or in all cases. So that, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a thing that I find myself teetering between a lot. Like, okay, do you need to put on muscle? Do you need to train at high intensity? Right? And then that equation gets flipped on its head when you start to look at heavier or stronger and stronger guys. As you start to work up to the elite, it's like they need to factor in that even their volume work, like even their 5s on a barbell, is going to be considerably more detrimental to the structure in the nervous system than 5s or someone who's a novice or intermediate. Right? So that thought process has to tier from elite to intermediate to novice.
Yeah, no, that makes sense for sure. When it comes to that, right, and the idea of, everyone likes to use the word where volume is the biggest driver of hypertrophy, and like, okay, well, whatever that means. People love to talk in binary terms without any context and think that that's like it. But when you have a guy that's advanced and you're trying to progress them, but you don't want as much load on them all the time with those specific movements, in your mind, what are you thinking about from a programmer's perspective to elicit that stimulus to create that adaptation, right? Because I mean, they can't, if they're an 800-pound squatter, they can't squat 400 pounds, and expect them to become a 900-pound squatter. Like that's not the case. But if they're constantly in that higher, weight load area, injury is going to be a bigger risk. So what are you thinking about from a, pure programming perspective of incorporating exercises that will give them that adaptation versus incorporating exercises that keep them healthy?
Right. Yeah. So I always think like there's two ways to look at it. One would be the primary variation of the main lift. Like I kind of put squat and deadlift on like similar pedestals to like, a perception of like accumulated fatigue. Like I'm not going to have someone block pull and reverse band squat in the same training cycle, right?
Right.
Like those are going to be lifts that even as like, let's not say it's 100%, but relative to the volume you're lifting, like if I'm doing fives, and with reverse band, those fives are going to be greater than a relative percentage of my fives without the reverse band. So it's going to be over 100%, right? So if I'm doing block pulls, much the same. So it's like I try and keep those two lifts in like in check with one another, like in a series of checks and balances. So like if I'm going to be overloading a block pull, I need to scale back my squat variation. So you might see like block pulls and front squats. Still, the front squat will be heavy, but you're going to be at least 30% lighter,
Right.
right? To accommodate for the potential of 10 to 15% more on that block pull. And it might be something where depending on the technical proficiency of the lifter and why the block pull is in there, block pulls might be waived, right? So I might waive block pulls with like a deficit or something, or some like maybe even an RDL
Yeah.
to offset that fatigue. Because a lot of heavy lifters, like you said, like I look at Jeremy Avila's deadlift progress when moving his deadlifting from once a week to once every 14 days, his heavy deadlifting. And the kid pulled 884 at 220, right? And before he was just kind of like, he was always a good puller, but it's understanding how to concurrently program for those big two drivers of stress and how to accommodate for that. So like the first chair, like the main movement, it's always about keeping a system of checks and balances of fatigue between the two main movements, in my opinion. Understand the variation, understand like almost like a fatigue coefficient or like an efficiency rating of these movements. And you can't have like a +2 with a +2.
Right.
Right. Like if a block pull is a +2, maybe you're doing block pulls and beltless high bar pauses, right? Because now all of a sudden you start knocking away. Like, well, if a low bar is a +2 with wraps, then you start to go into the integer scale of like, all right, well, now I don't have wraps on. Now I'm pausing. Now I don't have a belt. Now I'm in a high bar. Like that's still fucking hard movement, but it's going to be orders of magnitude less load on the bar. And then it's just like on the secondary, it's just going to be, okay, what damage control do we need as far as like supplemental movements? Like we have our primary lifts, we have our accessory movements, and we have our supplemental lifts. What's going to keep the wheels on the fucking track going into this prep from supplemental movement, right? Like I think a lot of times, like in a conventional strength and conditioning model, they do a vertical push, vertical pull, horizontal push, horizontal pull, and it's just like, fuck me. But in powerlifting, we do similarly stupid and redundant things.
Oh yeah.
Right, like integration of function of shoulders, hip, and spine is how I would look at it. If we're pinning the shoulder blades together in the bench press, I want to create a moment of upward rotation under resistance. Hey, you're going to bench? Sure, you got to bench. We might bench 2-3 times a week, right? Because it's going to be the lightest relative to all the lifts you do, but you're probably also going to be doing a hell of a lot of single arm dumbbell rows, allowing for thoracic flexion extension, allowing for thoracic rotation, allowing for scapward upward rotation. You're going to be doing AMRAPs on pull-ups, right? Just to reinstate that scapulohumeral rhythm. You're going to be doing, unilateral variations, whether it be walking lunges, whether it be Bulgarian split squat, to allow our hips to get into that extension and internal rotation, right? So we can start to see where we might be headed down like the path of injury, like single arm overhead dumbbell tricep extension. Oh, I can't get into this position. I can't get my humerus perpendicular to the floor. It's like, okay, that's kind of a problem. It's not a problem right now. It's not a problem for your bench press, but it tells us something about your shoulder. If your elbow hurts doing this, it's a matter of time before your elbow hurts, pressing on a bar. So as I start to peel back like from the primary and accessory movements of like, okay, here are barbell lifts depending on our timeout when we're in a less specific phase of training. I want to make sure I keep in checks and balances with volume, intensity, and exercise variation, the squat and the deadlift with safety squat, reverse band, use of wraps, no wraps, sleeves, no sleeves, belt, no belt, high bar, front squat, safety, block pull, deficit, dumbbell RDL, Romanian deadlift, stiff leg deadlift, good mornings, like basically all your hinges and all your squats. and you rank order these in some sort of fatigue coefficient or exercise efficiency rating, and they keep those in balance. Then I start to peel back underneath that and go, all right, shoulder, hip, and spine, how do we keep this on the track? What movements are going to be benefited by the utilization of scapular upward rotation, downward rotation, the utilization of full gait cycle movements, the utilization of anti-extension, anti-flexion extension, and anti-rotation of the spine. So that's kind of how I tier it in my mind. If I had to write like an intent-based programming, like algorithm or template, that would be how I would structure it. Have your A's and your B's, your primary and your accessories, your supplementals would be filled in kind of based off of the maintaining of integrity of shoulder, hip, and spine, quote unquote, function.
Yeah, that makes sense, man. I like how you put it in there too, that you're going to do some things that may create dysfunction if that's all you do. But the fact that you're incorporating those with supplemental lifts to extenuate that dysfunction is always going to be there, right? Like you hear a lot of times, the popular thing now is people saying that, retraction of the shoulder blades is a bad thing, and it's like, well, okay, how is that a bad thing? It's like, well, maybe it's a bad thing if every single movement you do, you retract your shoulder blades and you don't allow for any type of scapular movement to occur. But if you're doing that with the idea of like, I'm doing all my pulls to allow my scapula to continue to move and, all this other stuff to allow free range, then it's fine. It's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, it's not like the sun is going to come up like you're some sort of troll and all of a sudden your scap's going to turn to stone. Shout out Lord of the Rings. Right, but it's so dumb because look how, and Joe Sullivan put up a post, fucking shout out Joe, huge squat, all-time world record, fucking phenomenal performance. But Joe put up that post and broke the powerlifting brain internet, which is all right, that's red wire touched the blue wire, and everyone lost their goddamn mind. But there is never a conversation about grip width on the bar.
Right.
Grip width on the bar has to matter. Abduction is going to affect the intent of rotation and how much your rotator cuff is going to be active versus not. Right? I think it was such a overlooking here. It's how are you not considering how abduction is going to affect rotation at the shoulder? So I just think, you're not going to get set in stone. Understand that, because even too, we talk about scapulohumeral rhythm, and scapulohumeral rhythm is usually identified through a 180-degree arc of abduction. We start to see this 1-to-2 relationship of scapular movement to glenohumeral movement. But think of how little the humerus is moving through this arc, right? It's not like we're going through this full send. So I can understand maybe doing some lat work in isolation might be kind of fucking you up a bit. If you were to lock down the scapula and try and find a fully lengthened scap, and that was the only way you trained your lats was serratus on, extend humerus on that, because you're disproportionately disadvantaging that scapulohumeral rhythm through a greater part of this arc. But it's the bench press is not an overhead movement, so it's not that damaging. And let's not forget that the fucking bicep, deltoid, and tricep also stabilize the humerus in the scapula, right? We get so caught up in insertion to origin that we forget that all rotator cuff muscles go from scap to humerus. But won't you look at that? Tricep, delt, and bicep also go from humerus to scap, retrograde, anterograde. At the end of the day, it can't fucking be that big of a difference, right? So that's where I think that whole argument just falls flat on its face. Is we're not talking about the relative position of abduction and adduction. We're not talking about the overall movement of the humerus through the full arc of abduction or flexion. And we're not taking into consideration that we have other muscles of redundancy backup systems, as we have redundancy backup systems in everything in our entire fucking body. And people are oh no, you gotta protract your scaps, or retracting your scaps is bad. It's all right, tell that to Emily who. Tell it to Emily who folds herself in fucking half like a pretzel and squeeze her shoulder blades together as hard as she can. Her bicep and delt are going to be the primary driver of stabilization of the shoulder in her bench press. That's it. She loses those scap and that upper back strength, she's fucked. Sorry.
I think, that's where context comes into play, and so many people don't elaborate. They just put blanket statements out there without actually having context behind it, as in to elicit themselves as some type of leader in the industry. It's that's not the point of trying to help people out, right? you making these bold claims without any context to them just makes you sound like an idiot. Like you just learned something and you want to talk about that thing that you learned, but you don't fully understand it or conceptualize it, but you're going to put it out there anyways. It's like, well, like, you know,
I compare them to like conspiracy theorists.
right?
Like
Yeah.
people, they're literally the flat earthers of fitness. Because like I know something you don't know. It's like, yeah, but that thing you know is wrong. Like,
right, exactly.
Moron. But sadly enough, like that level of sensationalism, like I saw that post because it made a homepage somewhere because a bunch of people commented on it. It got a bunch of people riled up. And all of a sudden there's probably a good amount of people who read that devoid of context, obviously not offered, but now think that way. And now apply that to their training. And it's like, okay, maybe hopefully that fits for you and that's you've been able to superimpose context onto it. But there's a weird, like, any publicity is good publicity on social media thing right now. And it's just like quality is not there. Context is null and void. And it's just a matter of like sensationalism.
Right.
Like it's just, let's just say a bunch of inflammatory shit, rile up a bunch of smart people and like, you know, divide up a bunch of people who haven't thought that much about it. Like, okay, I think about this because I know an answer to this question now because, you know, buddy here said that like this is how we bench with our shoulder blades. It's like they just blindly follow, and it's like, fuck, come on, man.
Welcome to America, man, where all we do is blindly follow without actually looking into things on our own. It's crazy that's the
Hold on,
route.
let me get my mask. Never mind.
What's that?
I said, hold on, let me go get my mask. Speaking of blindly following.
Right. It's like the idea of having your own opinion and forming your own thoughts is not something that's widely utilized anymore. It's, you know, it's this idea of how can we get the mob to join in on my train of thought without actually having them think for themselves. And that happens so much in the fitness industry, especially from the context of like staying within your own scope of practice. There's so many things that, you know, I took your course, your 16-week course and learned a ton, but that doesn't make me you. I'm not going to start posting stuff that's going to speak outside of my realm of strengths and, you know, go into my weaknesses just because I took a course that I maybe understand but don't fully conceptualize because it's not what I do on a day-to-day basis. I'm not going to talk out my ass for that purpose, you know. But so many people do that. So many people will have a conversation with someone and be like, okay, based on this conversation, I just got more context to put out there. And it's like, but I don't fully understand it, but I'm going to do it anyways.
I think there's a deeper issue at play here, man. I think it's just two things. Like, people don't put out anything. Like, they lend to sampling from other people that they've heard it because they don't want to stick their neck out with their own ideas.
Yeah.
Because they're afraid of the backlash. And the reason they're afraid of the backlash is the same reason that they end up putting out other people's ideas, is because they fundamentally don't have like an identity of either about lifting or in a more metaphysical sense. Like, they don't really know what they think about certain issues. Like, I know what I think about the scapula of the bench press. That's why I can read and respect the fuck out of Joe. And I can read that and be like, no, like, absolutely not. Like, love you. You're a fucking amazing lifter. But so that's a big no for me, dog. But because I have an identity, I've established an identity around that. I thought about it before. I've spent many a night, you know, staring at the ceiling tiles, thinking, oh, I wonder what the scapula should do in the bench press. But I think a lot of people, they don't want to put the effort in, or they're afraid of the ridicule to not have a backing. Now, someone can go and be like, well, Joe Sullivan said this. And it's like, yeah, sweet. Like, that'd be someone, if I had to fight someone, I had Joe's cell phone number, like, hey, Joe, I'm in a bind. Can you come help me out? I would feel a little bit safer. Right. But I think that's what people, they lack, because they don't want to run the risk of like being wrong. It's like, who cares? I'm wrong all the fucking time. I'm a moron. And I tell that to people. It's like, look, like, if you can find a hole in it, this is as hole free as I've been able to make this concept in my own brain. And, you know, it gets stronger when someone pokes a hole in it, because like, oh shit.
Right.
All right, there's a weak point there. I need to figure out a way to reconcile this issue, or I need to get rid of it. And it's just like, when you approach it that way, you kind of devoid of emotional attachment, when like you can be proven wrong, it's fine. And if someone tries to prove you right and you can fortify your argument to counter, then that's the fun part, man. Like, I like that stuff. But I think a lot of people just, they don't want to do their work, or B, they're afraid of ridicule. But it's like, oh no, the mean guy on Instagram said a mean thing to me on Instagram. I was like, who gives a shit?
Right.
Like, you've been punched in the face? That's way worse than that.
Very true. Most people haven't. That's the problem.
That's the problem.
Yeah. Now I've noticed that a lot of your content has changed from the powerlifting side of things to more along the bodybuilding side of things. Why have you decided to like go more into that route? Well, I mean, I know you were working with Ben, and that kind of started getting your brain rolling to that conceptualization of like hypertrophy training and how you can bring your thoughts into that. And maybe there was a bigger gap there that needed to be filled. Whereas maybe in powerlifting, it's not as needed, but you changed your ways to be more hypertrophy based. Why did you do that and go on from there?
Yeah, a lot of it was just like my own training, man. And that's kind of been like my Instagram account is like, that's why it's to a certain degree maintainable, because it's like, well, this is the stuff I'm doing. Because like when I'm traveling, man, it's so hard to get off a plane and try and like, throw together an SBD session when you've been jammed up in an airplane for 15 hours. So I found myself traveling so frequently that my squat bench dead turned into push pull legs.
Yeah.
And like that was really like how I could accommodate with medium for the fatigue. And like you sit on an airplane, but it's your body's also traveling 600 kilometers an hour at 36,000 feet in a fucking tin can. So like the amount of G force that you're pulling is pretty crazy. And you're just wrecked. Like, so my last couple of years, like I did a meet last June. Well, not last June, the June before. So over a year ago. And, I squatted 4 times going into the meet in 4 different gyms in 4 different countries with 4 different pairs of shoes and 4 different sets of knee wraps and 4 different belts. And then I rocked up on the day. I was like, all right, I'm going to do this now. And it's like, that's not sustainable. So it's just more reflection of my own training. Cause like when I'm in the gym, I'm just always thinking about like, I'll look around and see like, oh, okay. Like I see most people, use an incline chair, but sit upright doing a bicep curl. It's like, do they know that it would be the exact same if they were just sitting upright on a regular chair? Like the incline chair doesn't put the shoulder into extension unless your torso is back. People don't know that. And I'll talk a bit more about that. Like where before, like, dude, Boss Barbell Club, that you walk in and you're eating fucking Ivanko plates for breakfast. Like right. That's just all I did. It was all I was surrounded with. But now that I've, been traveling and the staying on a barbell has been much more difficult. The muse for the content that I put out, the stuff that I write, the videos on social or the podcast topics is just training. I just go into the gym and I have like I use Google Keep, which is a little task manager. And when like something pops in my head or I see something or I'm doing something, I like write it down. And then when I have a camera ready, I'll film it. And so it's just purely reflective of my own training style with that's been the sustainable way to train for me over the last 2 years has been that. And that's just been reflected in the stuff I put out.
I also feel like from a business perspective, it's a far better move because I feel like that industry, at least the coaches, put a little bit more effort into wanting to learn and grow. So I think from that perspective, you can probably reach more people, and it's a more popular industry anyways, right? So I think from a pure business perspective, it's a good move too.
Hypertrophy and like body composition is that it's usually, I would say more often, I mean, it's different now than it was, man. I feel like everyone's got a coach, which is, I think it's a great move for the sport of powerlifting. But hypertrophy and bodybuilding coaching as something that's been well established for a long time, right? Like, you go back in the day, the Charles Glasses of the world, the Milos Sarachevs of the world, the Chris Cormiers of the world. And I think there's somewhat of a need for like a Renaissance way of thinking, where it is a little bit more about the quality of the stimulus. It is a little bit less about the quantification of just overall reps and sets, and being a little bit more cerebral about your execution. Like Ben would obviously be someone who I think pioneered that in the modern era. But we start to see, people rising to the top, and a lot of the coaches now are not who they used to be in years prior. And like you said, it has a lower barrier of entry to, I don't know, dudes that look like me and what you used to look like. Like no one really wants to come play with those kids in that sandbox. Like fuck that. That was like a pit at a Megadeth concert. Like I don't want to play around there. But yeah, and I think it has mass appeal that touches into powerlifting, right? Like powerlifters might go off, and I've had this before, like go off for 16 weeks and focus on hypertrophy and trying to improve body composition. And I think you played a huge role in that. We were talking off camera about, you know, your mini cuts and your kind of dabbling and crossing between the bodybuilding world and the powerlifting world. So I think where powerlifting, I don't rarely draws in a bodybuilder, but hypertrophy can draw in a powerlifter, it can draw in an athlete, it can draw in the 9 to 5. So it does have substantial more reach because I think just the barrier of entry, there's less aversion, there's less fear around the movements. Like, you know, back squat bad for your knees, and deadlift bad for your spine, and bench press bad for your shoulders, where it's like lateral raises,
right,
quad extensions. Like it's a much more, it's a very Nerf gun approach to like training people sometimes, and I think it just gets more people in the door.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I'm always interested in when it comes to like hypertrophy training from your perspective is how much of the training do you elicit to create muscle action versus muscle function, and where do you draw the line of like, you know, this is too much of one or the other that's not going to actually elicit the hypertrophy standpoint that you want? Like, how do you sprinkle that stuff in effectively?
Right. I think it starts with a good history. Like the function stuff is going to be dosed basically to try and get in a finite manner to try and get action to really take the reins. There'll always be like kind of an end tail to the utilization of function-based movements, which is like anti-lateral flexion, anti-flexion extension, anti-rotation of the trunk, gait cycle movements for the core, or gait cycle movements rather for the hips, and scapulohumeral rhythm integration for the shoulders, like roughly speaking. So depending on someone's need for reinforcing maybe bad structure, I have dislocated X, Y, and Z, or torn X, Y, and Z, that will indicate an initial offering of, you know, disproportionate function to action. Because like you can't fire a cannon from a canoe, right? So if we're trying to put on, you know, arms and delts and really trying to apply effective tension in an approximate fashion to some sort of failure point, that failure can't be as a consequence of dysfunction of shoulder, hip, and spine. Right. So we need to make sure that we're shoring up that potential weak link so that when we are taking sets close to some sort of failure, we know that failure point is not just a lack of capacity or stability of a joint to maintain integrity for us to apply tension through the muscles that cross that joint. So it is always on a sliding scale of the demand. But in hypertrophy, we do try, and obviously with like the tail end of, we're always going to be dosing some function in. We do try and go more the action route. And so isolation more than integration a lot of the times, but understanding that the integration piece will always be present. And then when we start to see issues with our ability to isolate, we might want to dose more to the integration side. You know, I use the example of like, if I'm doing overhead dumbbell tricep extensions, my elbows start to get sore. The overhead dumbbell tricep extension is very much an isolation exercise. It's like, well, maybe I need to go a less noxious stimulus in the overhead position, start to reinstate some of my shoulder mechanics. So maybe I take some time off of the overhead position of the tricep, and I start to work an increasing moment of like lat pull downs or scap sets or pull ups or chin ups or something in that position that doesn't hurt the elbow, that allows the scap to start to move and integrate freely, that is more function based in its intent. But it's always something you have to monitor. The initial offering is usually based off of like a history. I have a history of, I had ACL reconstruction, I had labrum tear, I had this, that, and the other. It's like, okay, let's see how you function first, right? And then, you know, let's put you on one leg, let's put you in the overhead position. Can you maintain stability and capacity in these positions? If you can, then we're gonna like, all right, let's start to peel this away. Like, how much can we get away with peeling back these quote unquote functional exercises, and how much can we just focus on putting tension across fibers, right, rather than tensions across movements. So that's kind of, again, it's always in flux. It's always something you need to monitor. Pain is a large part of that monitoring system, because pain will arise when we can't get into positions, and we're getting into positions we can't get into unloaded. We're getting in there loaded, and then we're putting tension across joints rather than tension across muscle fibers. So it's what I think to be a pretty good way to differentiate, especially for the hypertrophy crowd, the intent of a particular exercise. Like sometimes you'll see like a landmine press and a pull up to me are the same exercise if we look at it through the lens of intent and the lens of function. It's like they're both going to promote scapulohumeral rhythm. Press and pull, don't really care. We're going to allow for upward rotation to occur. by that categorization, I can now start to put exercises in a program where it's like, what do these have anything to do with one another? Right. One is a semi-overheaded push and a neutral grip. One's a pronated grip and an overhead pull. So but the common denominator is they both start to act at the scapula and allow it, and the movement is benefited by that scapulohumeral rhythm.
Now, when it comes to those type of exercises, are the progression schemes kind of the same thought process as you would if it was just muscle action, where the idea of progressively overloading them each week, as long as you're able to maintain form? Is that the idea of progressing it, or is there a different type of progression to the actual function component?
Right. So when we start to look at like research behind like predictive values, I use low back research a lot. Like predictive values of low back pain, we start to look at endurance more, right? Like if I can hold like a static low back extension for 2 minutes, the likelihood of me succumbing to low back pain, idiopathic low back pain, goes down in orders of magnitude. So I lend to more higher volume rather than low. So progressive over stimulus, absolutely, right? But understand that stimulus comes in a lot of different forms and fashions. And I think the issue with powerlifting is the one stimulus that we chase, right, is how we cross apply and progress everything.
Yeah.
Everything just gets heavier.
Right.
It's like, what? No, like at some point something will give. That's just like, that's kind of an inevitable law of nature. Like something will give if that's the only stimulus. So I tend to start to accumulate more volume through these function exercises, and maybe a higher density, like trying to make sure that, these movements, like if I think of a landmine press, for example, a big part of the landmine press is, reinforcing the opposite shoulder, the opposite hip. It's like, I will never be able to improve my pressing capacity in a landmine to come anywhere close to that shoulder's contribution in a bench press.
Right.
So I should probably look to have this exercise win at what it's good at. What will it be able to do that a bench press can't? Well, it'll be able to load contralateral counter rotation from shoulder to opposite hip. So I'm going to try and drive as much stress of that as I can. So rather than, I'll leave my 6 reps at heavy weights for my bench press, but I'll hit my 3 reps or my 3 sets for 12 reps for my landmine presses. Right? Like being able to assign a rep and set, and then obviously like a tempo and a rest period scheme to a particular exercise really shows I think an understanding of the adaptation you're attempting to drive with that exercise, right? Like if I need to maintain, scapular retraction for a set of 5 on a tempo bench, I don't want to hit a set of 5 on my heavy 5 on my landmine press, but maybe I want to have the duration double that time of going through upward and downward rotation of the scap, double the time that would be on the bench. So maybe I do 12 to 15 reps on a landmine press, lighter weight, but it allows me to kind of go through that full excursion of the scap that I'm not going to get. And I'm, rather than progressing it in load, I'm progressing it in time. Yeah. Right. And I could use rest periods. I could cut the rest periods down and increase density. Right. I could do them on numerous days in a week and overall improve overall volume of the movement seen throughout the course of a week. So there's a lot of different ways that we can progressively overload. Again, I prefer the term progressive over stimulus because that's really going to be what we're after.
Now, in terms of actual exercise selection, obviously the landmine overhead press may not be the best for eliciting some type of muscle hypertrophy for, say, the shoulder delt area.
Right.
At what point do you back away from that to really focus on growing the muscle as opposed to just accumulating that volume to improve the function? Because once the function's improved, do you get rid of that and add something in that's going to allow for more output into the targeted muscle, or do you keep that in to maintain that level of function? Because if you keep it in, does that volume then equate to kind of being closer to junk volume and taken away from your ability to recover from the other stuff?
Yeah, 100. And like you'd see a landmine press in a situation where an overhead press isn't possible, right? And overhead presses are more often not possible for people who have dysfunction at the shoulder.
Right.
So it is merely a therapeutic stepping stone to get overhead. And then once we get overhead, the overhead dumbbell press now becomes our canary down the coal mine, right? Like, so if I progress someone from, think of someone walks in the first day and they're doing cable external rotations at 0 degrees abduction. It's like, okay, the end of this road should not be cable external rotations at 0 degrees abduction with 50 or 60 pounds.
Right.
The end of the road of this exercise should be a dumbbell overhead press.
Gotcha.
right? Because it's like here we're going from strength in a structurally stable position to stability in a structurally unstable position. Like we need to be able to navigate across numerous axes of progression at the same time, right? Or indices of progression at the same time. So like someone would look at this, very generic cable external rotation exercise and not be able to abstract out a progressive or a progression that leads to a dumbbell overhead press. Right. So maybe we go here, and rather than going increase in weight, we change the instability. We go to 0 degrees, 90 degrees of abduction, right? And then we start to go, all right, now we want to integrate as we start to approach more unstable positions. So we could go 0 degrees abduction, external rotation, 9 degrees abduction, external rotation with the cable. Then we go landmine, half kneeling, contralateral landmine press. Then we go into maybe a 45-degree dumbbell incline. Then we go to a 70-degree dumbbell incline. Then we work to a 9-degree overhead dumbbell incline. And that you can do that progression over, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, depending on how advanced someone is. So I think using exercises as a means of progression rather than just using load as a means of progression is like a widely underutilized tool, especially in barbell sports, right? They just think, I'm going to chip it every week. And then if not, I'm going to drink a gallon of milk a day. It's like, maybe we shouldn't do that.
No.
Like maybe we should actually just pick exercises that are going to act as stepping stones. And at the end of these stepping stones, like for me, like the dumbbell overhead press, unstable load and unstable position, or a less stable load and a less stable position might be a better way to put it. Heavy walking lunges, dumbbell, barbell, or otherwise, offset load, unilateral loads, doesn't really matter. And then anything that's anti-flexion, anti-lateral flexion, anti-rotation of the trunk, like those are going to be things that I strive towards. And, in early stages, like with the core, like let's take the core, for example, because, the popularity of fucking 300 kilo deadlifters doing bird dogs before they do the 300 kilo deadlift is like, guys, come on, really? Serious? It's fucking 2020 still, maybe, I don't know. But like that anti-lateral flexion drill, maybe that's a ipsilaterally loaded Bulgarian split squat.
Right.
Maybe if I load 70 pounds on the side of my involved side foot in my, like, let's say my left foot's forward and down and the dumbbell's in my left hand, that's now my anti-lateral flexion movement. Don't necessarily need to be doing side planks for my pre-activation deadlift thing. It's like, no, maybe makes you feel good. You can wear Crocs when you lift too. That'd probably make you feel good, but it's equally fucking useless. Or like anti-rotation, like the bird dog.
Right.
Okay, like if you did a unilateral farmer's carry with like, I don't know, a 70 kilo dumbbell or 70 kilo farmer, like that's going to be a hell of a lot more anti-rotation, right? Rather than just having this remedial sort of thing. So I think using a mindset that creates a progression with exercise selection rather than just hammering something with load. It's like, okay, like it's only going to take you so far.
Right.
Sometimes it's not a place you want to go.
That's very true. I think a lot of people have a bit of a disconnect between loading up their warm-ups I think that's why a lot of people stay within that realm of body weight warm-ups and stuff, is because they don't want to tire themselves out before they actually do the main lift. You make that face, but it's true.
I know it's true. I know it's true that people think that, but I also know people are silly.
It's like, doing suitcase carries, that's going to wear me out. I got to do heavy squats today. It's like, well, oh, really? Is that your main concern, that these suitcase carries are going to wear you out? That's more of an issue than the suitcase carries.
Right. Yeah. Like the ticker can't handle it. Like my body couldn't possibly like buffer all this lactic acid caused by like 20 yards of, or even still, like if you're looking at it that way, then load them on another day where they're so heavy that your need for this activation goes away.
Yeah.
Right. Like if it's an accessory movement on the end of like a bench day, and you're holding 30%, 40% greater load than you would feel comfortable doing before your precious back squat. If I'm driving a higher stimulus and adapting to a higher, heavier stimulus of anti-rotation on like a non-involved day, when I adapt to that stimulus, I'm going to be more likely to be able to walk under a bar and not really need to activate my ability to anti-rotate or anti-laterally flex. Because I know that 3 days ago I could pick up an 80 kilo dumbbell and go take a walk forward in one hand and I could stay stable. I just think people don't see the fluidity in their approach. My warm-ups are so fundamentally different than they were 4 years ago. because I'm a different lifter.
Right.
Like my warm-ups are usually that. My warm-up for my squat is usually my unilateral farmer's carry or bilateral farmer's carry on a day that I'm not squatting. That's my squat warm-up.
Yeah.
Right.
Makes
Like
sense.
I don't need to go into this whole like, you know, I'll check a couple of the corners. I'll get on one leg. I'll hinge, and if all is good, like I know I have the capacity to, you know, anti-laterally flex, anti-rotate, anti-flex extend, or laterally stabilize the hip or stabilize the pelvis. Like I proved that a couple of days ago. That's not going away. So yeah, it's just silly. Like I think people, to get to where they want to be, they need to dispel with things that got them to where they are.
Yeah. No, that makes sense for sure. One of the other things I want to talk to you about when it comes to like hypertrophy stuff is the idea of exercise selection to elicit the most amount of growth possible. If you're like an evidence-based practitioner, you think like, oh, okay, well, you know, the studies show that EMG shows that this is going to produce the most amount. What in your mind, how do you start thinking about exercise selection, and what is the flaw behind EMG and things like that to elicit the idea of best exercise selection for muscle growth?
Right. So I think EMGs are too commonly drawn a false equivalency to tension. EMG is not measuring mechanical tension. Right. And we know mechanical tension to be likely in my opinion, the leading driver of hypertrophy. Right. So muscle damage is kind of going the wayside, I think, a little bit. It might be more of a byproduct or consequence of hypertrophy. So mechanical tension and muscle damage are kind of taking the reins. So like if you're going to tell me, like, this is a very low hanging fruit example, we know things about length tension relationships and strength curves. We know that when muscles are short, they generally have a decreased ability to produce force. Yet, you know, you can see plenty of research on like a hip thrust that would indicate that a hip thrust has greater EMG activation. And this is a trend we see in muscles in shortened position.
Right.
And muscles in shortened positions tend to outrun other exercises in a comparative analysis for a greater EMG activity. I don't even want to call it activation, EMG activity. But if that doesn't reconcile with what we know about kind of basic muscle physiology and kind of physics and biomechanics. So I think the biggest issue is making that false equivalency between EMG activation or activity and trying to falsely equate that to creating effective mechanical tension. Now, to answer your question, what does affect it? I think understanding insertion, origin, action, function, and then being able to, you know, depending on like the strength curve resistance profile thing is an interesting way to look at it, but there's a lot more to it than the initial offering that most people talk about, myself included. Like a strength curve is going to change from rep to rep, right? Like as fatigue onsets, the strength curve is going to change. But I think setting up the movement by understanding the anatomy of like the exercise that we're dealing with is going to give us, or the anatomy of the muscle that we're trying to train is going to give us the greatest chance to either create the most effective muscle damage or create the most effective mechanical tension. Sorry, not muscle damage, metabolic stress or mechanical tension. So like an example I would always use is like the double high cable bicep curl when people do it in the middle of a rack, right? They set up the cable and it's fucking 5 o'clock on a Monday and they're throwing up the front dub in the middle of like the commercial gym. It's like the best thing that person can do is do that one at a time and respect that the relationship that the humerus has with the scap and the neutral scapular plane, right? Like he can do more weight, he can do more reps, but I know the mechanical tension that he's creating or the metabolic stress that he's creating is not tissue specific to where we're trying to drive the adaptation. So like, I think understanding how the body's put together, understanding insertion and origin and how your body's going to traverse that against resistance and how we can effectively just put tension across the fibers of the muscle and nowhere else, I think is most people's best bet. And that's obviously on the stimulation standpoint. And we always have to consider like the adaptation standpoint. Like, you know, your nutrition is going to be like you could do high cable bicep curls with one arm and the neutral scapular plane and all this stuff and go eat fucking Tostitos. And then you're still going to have 11-inch pipes, you know?
Yeah, for sure. I think the idea that what you just put out there is one reason why volume is the biggest driver of hypertrophy is like a misnomenclature, because how are you able to quantify what each rep is doing in these studies if you're not actually putting it in the exact positions that it needs to be in, right? Because I feel like the better you can target those muscles, the better exercise selection, the less volume you're actually able to do and the less volume you actually need too.
I think of it like throwing darts. right? Like, because I mean, we both had the privilege to train with Dan, and Dan carries an insane amount of muscle. Like, it's just dumb how much
Ridiculous.
muscle. But his ability to take, like, his skill is so in tune with his compound movements that like a metabolic or neurological failure is his failure. It's never technical.
Right.
Like, he's going down like the violinist on the Titanic. If it's going down, he's just gonna, like, he put up a safety squat bar fail at 7 to 71, as you do, fucking psycho. And he just, like, 10 minutes later, he put on like some extra loud trap music and hit the ammonia, and then he hit it again, and he actually got it. But like, there was never a wavering in technique. So I think of it like throwing darts, right? Like, here's a guy who can go in the gym and effectively put enough tension through a muscle that it adapts and grows because he's throwing precision. Right. He's going down the pipe. I need a triple 20 to get whatever, 180, whatever the fuck it is. And he's just throwing that dart. I know that I'm going to hit 6 reps from this deficit belt list with 716. I couldn't do 6 reps from this deficit at 718. I couldn't do it at 704. I couldn't do it for 7 reps. I couldn't do it for 5 reps. I will come in and I will hit the exact point, that exact threshold for stimulus to be evoked where I'm at right now. His ability to do that, I think, is unparalleled. But if anyone else came in the gym and didn't have his skill level, it was like, I'm going to pull 7 off a deficit at this weight, and I'm going to grow. Like, no, you're not. Because like, maybe that weight, if your technique was better, you could probably pull 10 or 12. So you're actually 30 to 40% less or further away from that proximity to failure metabolically or neurologically that would actually elicit that stimulus. But I think good lifters, like you said, like, I mean, we talked in the past about Sean, right? Like, and his training frequency, and is like, because what do you expect him to do? Sets at 12 with a 805 back squat? Like, fuck that.
Right.
He's going to come in, he's going to hit it, and he's going to slide down the back of Brontosaurus Rex like fucking Fred Flintstone. He's going to call it a fucking day, right? Because work is done.
Right.
And he just hit it right. It's precision, and people don't respect the precision that it takes. Like, and this is why these guys go rogue and intuitive in their programming. Like, hey, what do you got today, Dan? I don't know. I want to hit like 3 or 4 of what? Something heavier. I was like, okay, right. But there's so much to that, right? Because he would be able to like feel his warm-up sets. He's like, oh, actually, I think I'm going to go out of 771, or I think I'm going to go 804 or whatever. And he would be able, because he knew that like, this is the difference. This is where he'd be driving the adaptation. Like, and he was able to hit it. Right. Like, he would Babe Ruth it every single time. He'd sit up there like fucking coked up Babe Ruth and point to the left field. And all of a sudden that bomb's going over the wall.
Sure.
Just like he calls it. And I think that's where, that really, in my mind, separates an intermediate from, and even an advanced from an elite lifter, is that ability to just hit that nail on the head.
For sure. I agree, man. Well, I appreciate all your time as always. Thank you. I feel like, I wanted to make sure we talked a lot of training, because I feel like we could do a whole podcast without talking training. So people don't tune in for our philosophical views on life and stuff like that. Although you've been more into that for sure. I enjoy hearing you and Jordan bullshit about that stuff.
Yeah, you find God in the bottom of a suitcase sometimes.
But I know you guys have a lot of stuff going on with Prescript and everything. And so if you want to plug any of that, feel free to go ahead. I know you have the barbell coaching course that is either about to start or it is starting. I can vouch for the level 1 Prescript course. It is probably one of the best things I've spent money on as far as learning goes in a very, very long time. The level of biomechanics and programming and skill acquisition in terms of becoming a better coach and athlete is just bar none one of the best out there. So congratulations on that, sir.
Honored, man. Thank you. Coming from you, that means a lot. I'll Venmo you later for the plug. But yeah, dude, I don't know. Like, follow us on Instagram. We got courses running. We do stuff. We talk about. I usually try and like. Remember, you ever watch the Price is Right as a kid?
Of course.
Where Bob Barker always used to talk about like getting your pet spayed and neutered.
I've been hit on the head too many times to actually remember.
Well, so at the end of every episode, he's like, "All right, guys, we'll see you from Burbank, California. Get your pet spayed and neutered." So for that, I don't know. Like, we have a website. It's on there. It's on my Instagram. I usually tell people to go to. You know who Chris Hughes is?
No.
Chris Hughes is a powerlifter. He's out of the Northeast. he doesn't know that I do this, but he has a charity called the Mr. Mo Project.
Okay.
And so Chris lives with 15 elderly dogs. And so he goes out and rescues and like rehabilitates like elderly dogs, whether they're abused or in shelters, and like they just live with them. So I just tell people to go to mrmoproject.com rather than like any of the crap that I talk about. Like, and if you're going to spend money, spend it there. Go give money to a dude that takes care of old dogs. Don't fucking, if you read a book or get a library card, I don't know. So that's the plug. That's a plug du jour is go to, I think it's Barks and Barbells on Instagram, Barks and Barbells. It's Chris Hughes, and he has a charity called Mr. Mo Project. So do that instead of doing other stuff that might not matter in 5 years.
There you go. All right.
There you go.
Mr. Mo's Project. Check it out, guys. I appreciate your time, man. I know you're busy, so I'm always grateful whenever I get to talk to you. I always enjoy it, so I appreciate it.
Good to catch up. Glad to hear you're doing well, man. All the best. All the best to the fam. I'm going to have to come busy out in Florida.
Yeah, definitely, man. Hopefully I'll see you soon.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Take care.